the deregulated sexual and love marketplace. Back when we lived in tightly knit communities, our elders couldn't help but be involved in our relationships, in our friendships, in who we chose to hang out with, who we chose as friends, who we chose as mates, who we married, and who we interacted with in general. For they were always there. They were always around when we interacted with other people. We were raised in a community and everyone knew everyone. Nothing was hidden, and people had a general sense of who everyone was, especially the elders. For the elders knew every single child that was in the community. They knew their parents, they knew how they were raised, they knew who raised them, they knew what kind of children they were. They probably had insights that only elders could have, knowledge through their lived experience of how people are, of human nature, of relationships, and how they are conducted. And with this knowledge that the elders had, they had developed best practices, what we would naturally call culture. And this culture had certain rules, practices, and regulations to kind of like regulate sexual practices, how sex was conducted within the community, and how love was also conducted. For these are two resources, two very valuable resources, which is sex and love. Obviously, the woman held most of the sexual value within the community, and the men held most of the love, for the men could generate the love through their work, through the time and the attention that they invested. And the woman would offer up their sexual value, their youth, their beauty, and their fertility. And this would be traded for a more or less equal value of love. And it was the elders that conducted these exchanges. It was the elders that regulated this marketplace of sex and love. This regulation wasn't only within marriages or romantic affiliations, it was also within the friends that their children kept. For parents would also regulate the friends that their children had so as to make sure that their child didn't invest their love, didn't invest their time and their attention with the wrong crowd, with the wrong people that would teach them all things that wouldn't be conducive to the child's path and the child's aspirations in life, whatever goals or aspirations that the parents may have for their child. This too was a form of regulation for your attention, your love, and the time that you spend with your friends is also valuable. And that too is traded often for love, for their time, for their attention. And within this trade, I think you both get a valuable or equal exchange of knowledge, of culture, of experiences. And sometimes this knowledge, this culture, these experiences may not be beneficial for you. And when we lived in buildings that only had one floor, I think the relationships that we had didn't just exist between two separated individuals. There wasn't this rampant individualism that we have today. For if you had a friend, then your parents probably knew that friend, and so did your other friends, and your siblings, and your parents, and your friends' parents were probably friends as well. They knew each other. If they weren't friends, they were well acquainted, for they would be in the same community. They would hold the same values. The same sense of community would also translate into your romantic affiliations. For whoever you fell in love with, whoever you chose to invest your money, time, attention, love, and sexual capital into, wasn't just your investment, but the investment of your family as well, the investment of your friends, of all those around you. In a sense, nothing was private, nothing was individualistic. Everything happened within a community, and everything was regulated by the community. And therefore, you had to follow the community guidelines. The culture that existed within the community had to be obeyed so that you could all live cohesively together and probably grow stronger and fend off attacks, be they physical or ideological, from other invading communities. And within these relationships that you would have, within these relationships you would form, or that your community would help you form, within friendships, I think the general goal would be for all of you to develop into well adjusted human beings, well adjusted members of the community, and to gain skills, to gain strength, to be social and equipped. But within romantic relationships, I think the main aim would have been to bear children for when you would get married, or a couple of months after you would get married. The community, your family, or the bride's family would pressure you into having children, for that was the purpose of relationships, of romantic relationships. But as we have become more individualistic, as we are more separated, as our buildings, our living structures climb higher and higher, that is no longer the case. That pressure doesn't exist anymore. And within that, the culture either disappears completely or changes into something entirely new. For in a sense, the value that people find in other human beings, the value of the relationships that we have, would also change as our living arrangements changed, as in a community, the value of our relationships were having children, building families, or improving our skills, our social skills, and the general well being of the community. As we've become more segregated, other values kind of crept up, values that were sated by the community are now values that we find within individual human beings. For the more segregated people become, the more lonely they are. And so now relationships are, in a sense, no longer about the function that they serve, which is to build the community, to strengthen each other, to build each other's skills, and to improve in general. And especially within romantic relationships, they are no longer only for marriage, having children, and building the community. For now, there is this creeping loneliness, this loneliness that you naturally should feel as you become more segregated, as you continue to live in a more individualistic society. The relationships now also have to factor in the assuasion of loneliness. Even though this may seem like a minor change, it has massive implications. For now, in this society, in a more materialistic society, the humans or the humans within the society also become capital. In a sense, time and attention is more scarce and, in that sense, more valuable. We may try to hoard it, to collect it, to form relationships with others, not for any particular function, but just to assuage the loneliness that we have. Relationships that are not regulated by the community elders, that are not regulated by your parents or your family. Relationships that may be destructive, that may not lead to anything at all. And this is especially destructive within romantic relationships. When we form relationships to kind of like assuage loneliness, there are many other implications that come with relationships that maybe may have not been planned for in your pursuit to not be lonely. You may end up getting into a relationship with someone that you may not have particularly chosen if you were not lonely, and may end up making decisions or falling into decisions, permanent and binding decisions, with someone that you are not fit for, that is not fit for you. You may end up in a marriage, you may end up having a child, you may end up doing business, or falling into unscrupulous activities with these friends, with these romantic partners that you only approached, that you only made yourself acquainted with just because you felt lonely. In individualistic communities or societies, life becomes more expensive because nothing is shared and everything is private. And as things become more expensive, more and more people are forced to work. For instance, in a community or a tightly knit community, everyone would have their roles, everyone would be valuable according to their strengths, according to their knowledge and what they were suited to do best. We would acquaint ourselves with more of our primary roles as humans, which is hunting and gathering. For the men would go out and hunt, and the women would go out and gather. But life has changed, technology has advanced, and we've become more segregated, more individualistic. And there is no more gathering, and there is no more hunting. For now, we work in a more intellectual space, in a less physically demanding space. And this has changed the roles. This has changed who does what roles and kind of like integrated the two roles into just one role, which is work. But this change of the society, this change of the culture, does not change the biological differences within men and women, for they are still underlying. They're still there at the base, at the foundation of what it means to be human. And they will demand their say. They too still demand to be expressed. And within these changes, all kinds of other complications arise. For we know that a man is his work, and work is very important to a man. It gives him a sense of self, a sense of identity. A man's work is his ability to love. For as a man, you love because you care and protect. It is not the other way around. You do not care and protect because you love. And that is something that can be very confusing, something that may be hard to learn, especially in an individualistic society. For we are not purely rational human beings, and to act and believe that we are is willful ignorance, and that is a pathway to hell. So, as our living structures change, as our buildings and homes become taller and taller, our culture also changes, and we find ourselves in a culture without elders, in a culture where there aren't any people, any old and wise people to regulate sex, to regulate our love. And therefore, we find ourselves having to regulate ourselves if we can. And most of the time, we feel a sense of freedom in the sense that there is no one regulating us, there is no one overseeing our actions, our decisions, and we have the illusion of free love and of free sex. And we think that our sex and our love is a private matter. This raises an entirely new culture, a rationalistic culture. Culture is more important to men than it is to women, for women are initiated by nature and men by culture. But in a culture without elders, there is no one to initiate the men. Therefore, the men are kind of lost. They wander around hopelessly, grasping at straws, trying to figure out what to do with their lives, trying to find meaning in a meaningless society, trying to find meaning without community. And in a sense, it is more difficult because the men have to initiate themselves if they ever get the epiphany that they are in such a situation where they are in dire need of initiation in the first place. The men have to initiate themselves in a culture in which they know nothing about. They first have to learn their current situation or the community or society in which they find themselves in. And then they have to know what their role is in the society and how they can extract meaning and life from it. And from there, they have to initiate themselves and kind of like put themselves through a painful rite of passage in which they come out the other side stronger and more capable, more resilient, and more built for marriage. And this is a very difficult task, if not impossible, to do in a rationalistic society. For in these societies where there are no elders, in these communities where there is no regulation of the sexual and love marketplace, there is no marriage. And in order to understand why there is no marriage, we first have to understand what marriage is. For marriage is kind of like a vow to a god or a supernatural entity so as to keep a union between a man and a woman. And in an atheistic, rationalistic society, There is no God to vow to. There is no one to watch over the marriage, to oversee it, to grow it. There is no one to pray to. And therefore, marriage cannot exist. So, in a real sense, the men are kind of thrown into the deep end. And it's either they sink or they swim. It's either they find out how to initiate themselves and kind of like figure out how to extract some meaning from this culture, from this society, from this life, and live a fairly decent life. But most of the time, the men sink. For culture is about marriage and sex. And in a society where there are no structures, there are no elders, in order to facilitate these rituals, in order to facilitate and regulate these practices and these actions, there is no culture. And where there is no culture, there is no one to initiate the men. The children are fatherless. We will find fatherless daughters and fatherless sons. And when the father is cast out, this inevitably leads to slavery for whomever the children of the father may be. For female virginity is relatively straightforward, but for men it is different because they are initiated by nature, and nature has its safeguards, nature has its signs and its signals in order to show if someone is a virgin or not. But for men, it is different. For virginity for men is different based on their culture, based on the particular father that they happen to be under. For an Abrahamic culture, the virginity is basically broken when the man gets saved or comes to God. In the more deistic cultures, the virginity of the man is more or less dependent on the parents, on their teachings of their gods, and on his practices, on his keeping with the rituals of their parents, of his father. And more often than not, the deistic and monistic cultures often overlap, and the rituals performed in the monistic cultures often translate to the deistic cultures. Virginity in more monistic cultures is often a rite of passage in which the man kind of like experiences an immense amount of pain, and in a sense he must acquire or achieve the warrior's salvation, and this more often than not determines his success within the mating world, within marriage, and so forth. But in the rationalistic culture, the loss of virginity for a man within the culture, or the lack thereof, is often very difficult to obtain. For the loss of virginity in rationalistic cultures is the red pill, or getting red pilled. And this often comes too late in life, when the man is well into his 40s and life has changed in a sense, when he experiences hardships within his relationships, within his love life, which make him question everything that he's learned, which makes him question whatever roles whatever obligations that he has been taught, and most importantly, which makes which make him question his father. For the act of sex has always been the same for women, in that which it is an act in which babies are created. But for men, what sex is defined by the culture. For in Christian cultures, for in Abrahamic cultures, sex may be a union or a marriage of two people, a joining of souls. The same would be true in deistic and monistic cultures, in which souls would be tied together to form an even stronger bond with not only the two individuals and their souls, but with their ancestors as well. But in the more rationalistic or individualistic communities and societies, sex is defined differently for man. For sex is more of a symbol of status, of self-worth. It is more of a measurement of the worth of a man. And if only subconsciously we all know that this is false, that sex does not define the masculinity of a man. And in these rationalistic, individualistic communities or societies where work is kind of ambiguously defined and everyone is forced to work, that means that it is not only men that have to go through initiatory rites, but the women have to as well. And these rites of passages are usually there to masculinize the people that go through them. And this is usually good for men, but it has a negative outcome for women. For the women still still have this need to be in relationships, to form families, to have children, and them being forced to go through these male initiatory rites and forced on them by the culture, more often than not, makes it more difficult for them to find a mate, to settle down, and to have children. For there is something deep within a woman that despises independence. And in order to understand this feeling, we have to go back to how we love. For a man, we love because we take care and provide. It is the act of our work that induces these emotions, these feelings of love within us. And for women, I think they love because they depend, because they need the other for their survival. And when these roles are diminished, when these roles are kind of made obsolete within our current culture, there is a deficit of the feeling of love. For women do not acquire love from providing and protecting their romantic partner. They may do so from their children, but not from the man in their lives. And it is the same for men, for they do not generate or evoke the feeling of love when they depend and rely on someone else for their well-being, for their sustenance, for a way of life. It diminishes both parties and is equally horrible for everyone within the community or the society. For in these switching of these roles, even though the picture may still look the same, the fundamental definitions have changed. For there is no father anymore. Not only is there no father, there is no mother either. So when you see the rise of single parent homes, or more or less fatherless homes, in a sense, you have to understand that these children have not only lost the father of the home, they have lost the mother as well. And they grow up fatherless. Not only the physical realm, but the spiritual realm as well. For the value of a man, or who the man is, comes from his memory, from his history, and from his skills. And his value is more often determined by the prospects of his future. For the woman, her power, her strength comes from her youth, her fertility, and her beauty. And her value and worth is more often determined by her past and her experiences, or lack thereof. And in this new culture, the men kind of like have no experience, and the women have all the experience. You can see how this can be horrible. You can see how this can be devastating to the sexual and love marketplace. For rejection, failure, and loss grows men, makes them more resilient, more stronger, more masculine. It increases their value. But for women, it does the opposite. For as a man, you need something to contend with, something that challenges you, something to push up against. For pain is your life source. This desire, this need is built into you. This is your biological imperative.